guys, what's up? This is Levi, the Christian Alpha, here on the RPC podcast. We also have Rock and Roll Chuck and Osmium Zulu here. We're going to be talking about personal boundaries and how to reinforce those if you're in a situation where you have to react because your boundaries violated versus proactively setting boundaries. Like and subscribe. Hit the little notification bell so that you get heads up here when we do post another vehicle. Also, shout out to Redirected FS and our Horizon. They do a wonderful job with all of the editing here, making a 45-minute conversation much smaller. So thank you guys.
Like a 5-minute intro into a 30-second intro.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so I want to talk about boundaries, how to reinforce them. I think let's talk about proactive boundaries versus reactive boundaries. Guys, in your relationships, how did you go about proactively setting up personal boundaries, the things you didn't want your girlfriend to do before you were dating, and then once they became your wife, how did you go about continuing to proactively set boundaries?
And he went right there, didn't he? Yeah. Dude, I did not have any boundaries when I got married, okay? I found Married Red Pill after I got married, and the first post that really impacted me was Strategos, Auto Creators, how to build boundaries during your transition. So I learned from that post that there's something called boundaries and you're supposed to have them. And I didn't. So I had to start from the ground up and basically determine not only what my boundaries were going to be, but where to draw the line for each of those boundaries, and then figure out how to enforce it and how to defend it when challenged on those boundaries. That was all brand new territory for me because, like most guys, I just let life happen to me before then. So yeah, it was an uphill battle.
Okay,
yeah, mine.
So go ahead.
Well, I'll go ahead and just say, so mine was a little different in that growing up and going through high school, I was somewhat involved, or at least familiar with the early days of Red Pill, kind of more the pickup community, the So Suave forums, that sort of thing. So some of these concepts have been kind of percolating for a while in that. And so by the time I met my wife, I already had a pretty strong sense of personal boundaries. And by having those boundaries to start with, I filtered out a lot of women who wouldn't have been respectful of those boundaries, or wouldn't have otherwise been worth the trouble it would have had to have been to enforce those boundaries all the time. So for me to get around to actually marrying my wife, she had already been, kind of through that filtering. And so she started off with a pretty high level of respect for those boundaries. And it has actually, to a degree, me doing some of the, I guess, slip that happens with a lot of newly married guys, where it's like, okay, cool, I'm married, I won the game. And then over time, shortly thereafter, you start seeing more fitness tests, more bad behavior, more pushing of those boundaries. And that was what actually kind of steered me back toward Red Pill at that point. And I found there had been a huge development in that thought. But as far as boundaries go, it was a pretty natural returning to enforcing those. I mean, yeah, once those came up, then there was a little bit more testing. Oh, okay, so now you're really gonna enforce these things, but overcame that, and it pulled back together. So I think, just as a note to those of you guys out there who are still single, if you have strong boundaries now, you are much more likely to select for somebody who will respect those boundaries down the line.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Chuck, to go back to what you were saying, how did you go about reinforcing those boundaries, since you were starting from ground zero, clear to now you don't have a boundary problem? Because I think that would be a difficult process.
Well, boundaries have to be enforced over and over and over. It's less of a problem, but I would say it's never going to be not a problem. Nobody's always going to just automatically respect your boundaries, because you're always going to get tested. So the first thing was, well, what do I want those boundaries to look like? What is acceptable to me and what crosses the line? And it's pretty easy to say what's acceptable. It's pretty easy to say what crosses the line. I think the hard part is those gray areas, especially the ones that are kind of accepted in society as being one way, when really, those are the kind of things that cause all the problems. And yet there's no good strategies for really dealing with those in a healthy boundary enforcing way, because everyone just kind of expects it's the old happy wife, happy life mantra. And hey, you want your wife to be happy, of course, but it's happy man, happy clan first. So
Yeah. So what I'm kind of looking for is like, how did those conversations go? Did you actually have conversations like, hey, been working on some personal development. Looks like I have no boundaries. These are my boundaries. Don't violate them. Like
no,
that's
no,
kind of the
no.
autistic way of going about it. But how did you go about having those conversations? Did you wait for them to come up? Was it a reactive boundary setting, or was there any proactive boundary setting? Just kind of like get into the nitty gritty there, because in my experience with the red pill and just dabbling in reading and MRP and stuff, it almost seems like there's you shouldn't actually talk about boundaries. You should just reinforce them with your actions. And so I think that a lot of guys struggle with, like, how do I actually tell my significant other what my boundaries are with just my actions? I imagine you can do that, but I feel like just saying those boundaries in some way, shape, or form is going to be a useful tool, as well as backing them up with actions.
Well, that's true. But you don't just autistically go, hey, look, woman, I'm laying down the law and this is going to be the boundaries, and then you're going to respect them because this is what the Bible says. And yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. Come on, we don't do that. First of all, you have to know where you're going to draw that line. And then you may get the chance for a conversation at a point where things just kind of come together and you're both in that mood, and the conversation may organically come up at a later time. But at first, for most men, it's not about setting healthy boundaries. It's about, I had no boundaries, and so therefore that's the life I'm living. How do I build them? And now that I'm building them, the people that I'm interacting with, especially my spouse, it's going to be like, well, I used to be able to do all this. It was never a problem. Why now? What's going on? Why have you changed? And that's because you're building boundaries. Those are going to be tested. And so most of the healthy boundary setting comes through testing. You get tested, you firmly but lovingly defend those boundaries. Sometimes people are going to get butthurt, and that's the way it goes. And you're going to get tested on those things over and over until you show that this is where the line is. And if you cross it, I'm going to push back every single time. And you're going to have to do that until you stop being tested in that area. And you'll stop being tested, for the most part, when she knows the boundary is important because you've defended it over and over again. If you back off one time, then really, what have you done? You have taught her that if you try hard enough, this boundary will move. And so therefore, you've caused an even bigger problem because you've trained her to try hard enough to change it. And you don't want to teach people to do that. If you're going to draw that line, you better defend it all the way up until you don't have to defend it anymore. If you give in one time, then you're just teaching people to just make sure you try really hard and eventually I'll give in. You don't want to do that. So most of it comes through testing. You may get an organic conversation that comes up. Some people may not. For some people, you may have a very level-headed wife. And you sit down and she asks what's going on. And she may bring it up. Is this a problem? Where do I draw the line? There are some people like that. My wife's not one of those people. My wife tests and I defend. And for most men, that's the way it's going to be. So it happens in the moment it's organic. It's not something you autistically lay out like a new mantra. It's just not like that. It's going to happen through day-to-day interactions, and you have to be mindful of it. Part of the biggest, hardest part is to just recognize when it's happening, to be mindful and be aware when you're being tested so that you can respond in the right way, or you can shut up and not respond and let your silence speak for you. Sometimes that's better. And for each person and each interaction, it's going to be different.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. So, gosh, I have a couple questions, but Oz, is there ever a time that you had to proactively set a boundary with your wife?
Kind of early on, and it makes sense. If you can get ahead of these things sooner rather than later, you're going to be in a better spot, right? If your boss comes to you and you're new to the job and says, hey, this is how things are going to be done now, you're kind of new to the job and figuring things out, and you're going to be pretty okay with that. If your boss of 10 years suddenly changes what your job title is, or it changes what you are and aren't allowed to do at your workplace, that's going to feel a little bit different there. So I think if you can get out of these things ahead of time, you're going to be in a much better position. So one early on that I was pretty clear with her about is we don't air our dirty laundry out with our friends or family. There's just no point to it. Explain the reasons why. At the end of the day, if we have problems with the way we're interacting with each other, they can't fix it, only we can. So if we go to them, we're just bitching about it, and that's just, there's no place for it. And there's a couple times early on where maybe she went to her mom or a friend or something like that and pushed that boundary a little bit. What's interesting is she actually came and tattled on herself at that point, and so it wasn't a big conversation that way, but I still had to say, yeah, no, that's a boundary we're going to keep here. And it was a pretty small battleground, but it's pretty funny now that we've been married for 8 years. She is horrified constantly by the way women talk about their husbands, their boyfriends, their guy interests. It just completely weirds her out, and it's so undermining of a guy. So if you don't have that boundary, you should have that boundary, in my opinion, because one, it doesn't change anything for the better if they're bitching about you behind your back or vice versa. Two, man, it looks really, really bad on a lot of guys the way their women talk about them.
That's good. So saying proactive boundaries, reactively setting, or I guess reinforcing boundaries. How's that? Like, tell me of a time or like a conversation where you had to reactively set a boundary or reinforce a boundary.
I can't think of specifically what it was that she said, but she said something that the tone of it was just really disrespectful. And early on, I had already said a pretty clear thing is like, we treat each other with respect. And so what she said wasn't something that I had specifically told her, hey, don't say it, or don't say it with that tone or anything like that. But there was a presupposition that we'd already established that we deal with each other respectfully. And so when she said it and the way she said it was disrespectful, she focused on, well, what I said, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean it disrespectfully. And so that was the way the conversation started. And you can see how quickly you would want, a lot of guys, and I at the time was definitely very tempted to take that bait to talk about the fact of what she said, not the presupposition behind what she said. And so taking the conversation up a level and going back to that preset condition is the way to go, in my opinion. I mean, at the end of the day, that's if you even want to have that conversation. For me, I don't remember specifically what she said, but I remember at the time it was something that if it wasn't addressed, it was going to get worse. And so we had that conversation as far as the importance of respect toward men. And part of it is when she grew up, she and her dad had not a bad relationship, but it just wasn't a very affectionate relationship in some ways. He was pretty distant. He worked a lot. And so she didn't have a really healthy understanding of what male respect looked like or how to be respectful toward a male. And so there was like a big learning opportunity there along the way. And, she eventually got it. And so it was a series of conversations, not just that one instance, but that was early on in our marriage, and it got so much better, so much quicker because it was addressed that way, back on that presuppositional level.
Yeah, okay. For mine, it's being an archaeologist, bringing up the past, digging it up, stuff that's already been dealt with and dead and buried, and you've smoothed the ground over, it looks nice, there's some grass starting to grow. Yeah, well, mine's good at digging it back up sometimes, and you know you need to put the kibosh on it nicely, treat her with love, firmly. You need to escalate enough to get her to back down. But if you escalate to yelling, screaming, and getting all upset and showing a lot of emotion, well, people love drama. And so a lot of times that just feeds into that need and actually makes it worse. The key is to be calm and address it. And then there needs to be consequences. You can't just say, you can't do this, you can't do this. If there's no consequence and they want to keep doing it, they're going to. So consequences can be, a big one is removal of time and attention, lack of conversation, emotional withdrawal for a time to get the point across. And those things have more power than most people realize. The problem is most men let their feelings control them too much. And I say this because I was one of them. And I still slip from time to time, but much less. And when you let your feelings control you, the other person starts to see that you're not in control, your feelings are. And if they can control your feelings, they can control you. And so that boundary you're trying to set, your emotions are tearing it down as your words are trying to build it up. So you have to deal with it calm, even though you're raging on the inside, or you're just so frustrated and pissed off. You can't show it. You can show that it bothers you, but you can't let all that emotion out and be on the surface, because it's like blood in the water. And it is. It'll just draw the argument out, and it's not good. So you have to control yourself. Self-control emotionally is one of the biggest challenges for many men, and it's one of the things that keeps them from being able to set a healthy boundary.
So I'm just going to be devil's advocate here for a second. Okay. So I'm thinking right now, if I were listening to this podcast, there'd be an easy point of criticism, which would be, why are you even engaging in this conversation anyways? Why aren't you just using Amuse Mastery or Agree and Amplify and just, diffuse it and dodge and move on? So what say you to that criticism or that challenge?
For some challenges like this, it depends on what kind of a challenge, what the subject is, and how serious it is. Sometimes Amuse Mastery is appropriate. Sometimes Agree and Amplify is appropriate. Sometimes being quiet or deflecting it is appropriate. And in your own relationship, you're going to have a good sense after a while of what works in certain situations. And also, some people just aren't good at Agree and Amplify. It comes off autistic, and it has the opposite effect. So you have to know what works. And yeah, those techniques can be very effective, but sometimes a situation calls for being serious, withdrawing, addressing it directly, being firm. It just depends. And what works for one person, another person in an identical situation, I may be able to use Agree and Amplify. Somebody else may use Agree and Amplify and may have the exact same approach. And in their particular relationship, it's going to cause damage. You have to calibrate for your own situation and know not only your relationship, but your wife and you. And it takes practice, it takes trial and error, and you're going to mess up, and you're not going to win every one. But, well, that's how you learn.
Yeah, I guess to add that, sounds like there's a time and a place for actually like being firm versus agreeing like having or using, agreeing, and amplifying, or like having this this amuse mastery sort of mindset.
Well, let me give you an example here. If we were in a group of people that we both knew, friends, and my wife was to say something disrespectful about me, she was to bring up something embarrassing, and everybody just kind of looked at both of us like, I can't believe she said that. Oh my gosh. And there's this huge uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Some guys might be able to laugh that off. Me, yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to laugh that off, especially if it's very disrespectful. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to be quiet. And I'm going to look at her and I'm going to look at them. And then somebody's going to try to break the silence. And I'm going to put up my hand and say, oh, wait. My wife was just saying this disrespectful thing. And I'm going to let that silence hang in the air, and I'm going to let her feel the weight of those words and the emotional impact that it has on the group. And after I've allowed that to impact her sufficiently, then I'm going to give a very stern rebuke in front of everybody. And then I'm going to do my best to turn around, make it humorous, and defuse it so that the group can go on and it doesn't poison the entire night. But sometimes you have to be stern and you have to make people uncomfortable to make a point. And I'm certainly not afraid to say hard things in front of a group. So it's highly situationally dependent, and it depends on you too. Some people can make that work, and some people it's going to crash and burn every time. They just can't do it.
What say you, Osmium Zulu?
About what specifically? If I were in that group situation and similar,
Yeah,
reaction?
I've never. I don't think I can recall being in a group situation where I had a girl interest or a girlfriend that did something like that. I'm sure probably in my days where I was smoking a lot of weed, there was something, but my memory's hazy from those days. Yeah, I feel like just a
funny
quick
concept.
stern, like, hey, that's not really cool. Don't do that, and then move on. Like, don't make it this big thing, but let her know, like, hey, you kind of messed up there and in front of people, and don't do that again.
Yeah, see, the way I would see it as, I've never had that situation come up with my wife, or really a long-term relationship. There was one girlfriend who tried that occasionally, but the thing is it's kind of a I don't think you're going to solve the problem there in the group setting, so I don't think you're likely to score many points because it's indicative of something that's a deep-rooted issue. One, either you haven't clearly shown how it is that you conduct yourself and expect people within your frame to conduct themselves, or she's not in your frame. That's really what that says to me. And so, if you're meeting somebody for the first time, or you're, out at a bar and you're like having some banter with some girl that's, cute or whatever, and she tries to blow you up in front of the group, man, that's like perfect amuse mastery. Like, just double down and just make it completely silly and ridiculous and own it. And like, that's going to be a great winning tactic. That it feels different if it's somebody that you have a long history with, somebody who everybody else sees should be in your corner but isn't, right? Honestly, I probably just wouldn't even address it. I would just continue on the conversation as if it didn't happen, unless it was one of those things that absolutely could not go unaddressed. But even that, it could be simple, like, wow, I don't really want to talk about that right now. Move on and talk about whatever you do want to talk about, because at the end of the day, she's living in your frame or she's not, but you should be living in your frame, not hers.
Yeah. One more topic I wanted to touch on before we wrap it up is the idea of, and we talked about this just a little bit ago, disciplining those you love. Jesus disciplines his bride whom he loves. But I haven't heard it said. John's mentioned this. How do you appropriately discipline your wife when she crosses those boundaries? Obviously, talked about withdrawing your time and attention. I kind of want to link this biblically, because a lot of people will kick back and say, oh, well, Jesus, Jesus disciplines, but a husband shouldn't discipline. There's like a disconnect. So what is the?
Well, we're not going to fix stupid in one podcast, so I don't know about that.
I'll give my insight on that. Obviously, you're not going to physically discipline as you would a child, but for me, two things have been effective. First, emotional withdrawal with your time and your attention. That's very powerful for my wife. I don't need to use it often. My wife seeks out my attention as much as possible. So that is a very effective technique. The other thing is pretty much, I would say, for lack of a better term, a stern word, just being very firm as a father to a child type of approach. And my wife has told me many times, stop talking to me like my father. But yet she responds to it. And you're disciplining the oldest teenage sometimes, only in the bedroom. But that's another matter. And there's discipline there too, but that's different. So
sorry, I'm just this is amusing.
No worries. They can edit it out if they want, but no, it's the emotional part is so powerful for most wives. They seek out your emotional energy, they seek out your approval, they seek out your attention. And so the most effective thing in most relationships is going to be to withdraw that. That is effective discipline. And then biblically, you need to look at how to re-engage. But there can be a time when you just kind of withdraw. Let her seek you out. Make it clear that, and I've had to deal with this more than most because I started from zero. I started with zero frame. I started with zero boundaries. And that was 5.5 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. I had a lot of work to do. I wasn't even aware that it was a problem, but I posted online, got my butt handed to me, got some great advice, and once I realized it wasn't a case of reconciling it, it was, wow, this is so true. How could I have not known this? What do I do? How do I implement this? And then you implement it autistically at first, and eventually, through practice, you find your groove. My advice to anyone who's married would be this. If you find yourself in a situation where you must discipline your wife for disrespect or for something else, verbally, be less harsh than necessary. You can always be harsher later and escalate if she doesn't get it. But most of the time, we let our emotions get the best of us and we just hammer it. And if you use the heaviest hammer the first time, it's not going to be as effective any other time. Don't escalate it and don't be harsher than you need to be to get the point across. But it's teaching, and teaching takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes practice. And the person learning has to be willing to learn. And sometimes sometimes you have to take the class again.
Yeah, so when I was starting to become familiar with the Red Pill before Red Pill Christians popped into existence, I was noticing correlations between how the way in which the Red Pill, or Married Red Pill, I guess, told to or instructed to withdraw time and attention, and how God, I guess, Old Testament was really a good objective example draw these boundaries. He'd say, hey guys, like worship me, only me, do these things, obey my law, like, and things will go well for you. And so over the course of time, they would disobey him, worship other gods, and he would warn them. And when they didn't listen to his warnings, he would withdraw himself, and bad things would happen. Like, he also said bad things would happen. And so I think, well, I know based on the Bible that there is biblical precedence for in a relationship, whether that's boyfriend girlfriend or whether that's husband wife. I can speak more on the boyfriend girlfriend because I've never been married, but just withdrawing some time and affection until I guess maybe they get what they did, or they just start being sweeter. So that's like, I wanted to link it a little bit biblically there. I don't have any scriptures off the top of my head. Maybe Romans, let's see, is it Romans 1:24-25? Therefore God gave them up to the lust of the heart, to impurity, to dishonoring, to the dishonoring.
I don't know if that one really applies in the same way, but in general,
probably not in the same way, correct?
The principle would be this. Jesus withdrew on a regular basis. And so, and Oz said he has to go. Oz, take care, brother.
Take it easy, guys. Have a good night.
Brother.
You too. Thanks for joining us. And so Jesus withdrew on a regular basis to go be with his Father in the wilderness. Modern men today don't withdraw enough. Some do, and some are totally withdrawn. In fact, a lot of them are withdrawn into video games and don't pay their wives any attention. We're not talking about those guys. We're talking about guys who every spare moment is spent with their wives. This is why we push mission so much, because not only is it what you're supposed to be doing for God, but if you spend all your time seeking your wife's attention, you're in her frame and you're asking to be tested. Your wife should be seeking your attention. And just like, let me think of a good way to put this. Anyone who gives their time and attention freely to anybody all the time is loose with their time and attention.
It's a good way to put it.
There's a sexual correlation there. It's very similar. So, yes, you want to make yourself available to your wife, or if you're dating, you want to make yourself available to your girlfriend, but you don't want to always make every spare moment available. You have a mission for God. You're supposed to be following that. You're supposed to be working on that. You're supposed to be building that. She should be wanting to follow you and join you on your mission. If your mission is to spend time with her and relax and just chill, be with your wife, you're going to be tested. You're going to have problems. It's going to be miserable. And the more you try to make her happy, the more miserable she's going to try to make you. You need to have a mission. It's just that simple. And if you have a mission, you can withdraw. You have a reason to withdraw, not just autistically because, oh, I need to withdraw. That's what, the book said. That's what they said on that podcast. Yeah, you need to have a reason. Otherwise, it's just going to look autistic. So
that's a good point. You don't want to come off as butthurt.
Exactly. And as there's a comment, if something happens, swallow it, sit there and stew, finish whatever you're doing. Then when the episode is over, when you got a little time, excuse yourself, go think about how you got yourself into this mess, start making plans to build a mission and do something else. But if you immediately withdraw, it's a reaction and it's not your frame anymore. You're reacting to another person and what they've done, and it's not going to be effective. They are going to see your butt hurt, and the testing is going to ramp up even more. And we got about a minute left here. Levi, you want to wrap us up?
Yep. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We will be back next week. Until then, don't forget, like, subscribe, click the little notification bell, and we'll see you on the other side.